Hello, hello, um, subscribers and others who have decided to join us. Today we are going to take the transatlantic slave trade, and the lecture, of course, would be one that will be interesting. The lecture will let us know how Africans were transported to Europe to do many works, and from then on, so many Africans are in the Americas and Europe. I would like to let you know that talk of the African Americans who are now in the US, or even those who are in the Southern America and Europe. Long time ago, most or almost all went there as a result of the slave trade. The slave trade, we mentioned their names, people like Michael Jackson, people like Michael Jordan, every popular musician, Black American, African Americans that you see out there who have stayed there as far back as 100 years and above have ancestry in Africa. Because of slave trade, most of them are now Americans, and some are even Europeans, those whose ancestry are associated with Europe. But why did this slavery, how did it come to be? That's what we would like to discuss here. How did the slavery thing come to be? Of course, 400 years ago, it started in 1441. And in 1441, Gonçalves, one of the Portuguese explorers, returned to Lisbon with a party of 10 Africans who be presented to the prince, Prince Henry to be precise. The prince received them with great pleasure, since he hoped to convert them to Christianity. The earlier meeting between Europeans and Africans, especially the Portuguese and Africans, the aim was to convert the Africans to Christians. And the Prince Henry was joyful, and he tried as much as possible to make these Africans get educated and get converted to Christianity. Though Henry's hope never appeared to have been realized. I must let you know that despite the push by Henry, his hope to get the Africans Christianized was not realized. It just didn't materialize as he wanted it. But this was the beginning that created that heinous crime of slavery. This was the beginning that created that heinous crime of slavery. More and more Africans were now brought to Portugal and sold. So the idea of selling humans came. And as those first Africans got to Portugal, 10 of them, the aim was to make them Christians. But as time went on, more and more of these Africans now they were brought to Portugal, and the buying and selling of humans began. A contemporary chronicler, so one of the chroniclers, recorded in about 1460 between 700 to 800 slaves, black slaves, African slaves, had been brought to Portugal to be sold. They were exported annually to Portugal. So roughly in about 1460, roughly about 700 to 800 slaves were taken to Portugal annually. Henry himself is said to have condemned the sale of Africans. You remember that Gonzalez took slaves, not slaves then, black men, Africans, to Henry, and Henry's aim was to make them Christians. But when the selling of humans, black men, came, Prince Henry was unhappy with this view. He was not happy with this practice. But the kings and princes of Portugal after him gave it their blessing. After Henry had left and died, those who came into power gave it their blessing, which means slave trade got the blessings of subsequent Portuguese leaders. Slave trade got the blessing of subsequent Portuguese leaders. Between 1486 and 1493, an average of 448 slaves belonging to the Portuguese crown were annually imported into Portugal. So you could take note of that. Between 1486 and 1493, an average of 448 slaves belonging to the Portuguese crown were annually imported into Portugal. Take note of that. And this can be said to have been the beginning. This can be said to have been the beginning of this heinous crime called slave trade. And as the Portuguese began to enjoy this trading in slaves, the slaves would now be taken to Portugal. It started from Portugal. Portugal became the base where slave trade started from. But it should not have taken that long, because, of course, the Portuguese population and all that, if it was only limited to Portugal, slave trade would not have taken 300, 400 years to exist. So you could see the impact which this trade created in the African continent, in the European continent, and later in the Americas, which was known as the New World at that time. Exports of slaves had been confined to Portugal, or even the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula, we are talking about Portugal, Spain. If the efforts of slave trade had just been confined to those places, the length that slave trade took would not have been. It would most probably have stopped very soon. I believe myself that if the slave trade had not moved to other aspects, to the Americas, to also the British coming to take part in it, the Germans and all that coming to take part in it, of course, this heinous trade would not have taken that length of time. When the Spaniards penetrated North and South America, this became the beginning of the why would I call it a terrible crime against Africans? When the Spaniards were able to penetrate, get into North and South America. Of course, one thing which will be sure is that after the conquering of the Red Indians, land was there, and land needs labor. But when the Spaniards were able to penetrate into North and South America between 1492 to 1554, they began to establish plantations and above all to exploit the fabulous mineral resources that are found in the America, and above all to exploit the fabulous mineral resources that are found in America. So you could see that the slave trade started in a very small way with the Portuguese, but the Spanish discovery of North and South America made them to have a large expanse of land, and that large expanse of land needed their labor of some type. And also, it's not the land alone which the Spanish were open to. There's also the fact that mineral resources were now being pushed for, and all this needs labor one way or the other. An acute problem of labor supply arose because of the indigenous people proved quite unequal to the task. Remember, when the Spanish penetrated North and South America, one thing was very paramount. They needed labor. And the first people they looked onto for that labor were the Red Indians, who were the true owners of the Americas. But the Red Indians were not equal to the task. The task of slave labor was indeed too enormous for the Red Indians, and they had to look elsewhere, which brought in Africans. If the Red Indians had been equal to the task, maybe today Africans would just be very limited in either Europe or the Americas. But the Red Indians were not equal to the task, and as such created an opening where Africans were looked upon for this kind of slave labor. The Indian population, for instance, in Mexico, for example, began to decline sharply when the Spanish continued using them. The Indian population began to decline sharply. For example, dropped from about 20 million in 1519. It dropped from about 20 million in 1519 to only about 1 million in 1608. So calculate the period 1519 to 1608. That should be rough. Sorry, the network seems to be having issues again, but we'll continue now. So in that 80-something years, about 19 million people had either died, fallen sick, something happening to them, and all due to the fact that the labor that is, of course, when the Spanish conquered the place, a lot of Red Indians would have been killed. Apart from them being killed, a lot of them would have fallen sick. Apart from them falling sick, a lot of them, because of the enormous slave labor, would themselves have died. And this, about 19 million of them died in between the year 15, I'm talking of the Red Indians now, 1519 to 1608. So you could see that about 19 million of them died between 1519 to 1608. And of course, naturally, with the enormous loss in labor, they have no choice but to run. and see whether the Africans would do better than them. It is interesting to note that the first batch of Africans exported to the Americans in about 1501 was sent from Lisbon. Lisbon is the capital of Portugal. So about the first group of Africans that were used for slave labor in the Americas were sent in 1501. And it was not until 20 years later that slaves were transported directly from the West Coast to the Americas, which means directly from West Africa to the Americas. About 20 years that were directly from West Africa to the Americas. So more slaves were now used. More slaves were now used. But I want to put this into context so that those who are listening to me, Africans all over the world who are listening to me, would not get it wrongly. Slavery as a practice had always been part of man's way of getting labor done. Man's way of getting labor done. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, you remember the Hammurabi Code, all these groups of people have used slaves one time or the other, and the way they use their slaves is either how do they get their slaves during wars. They capture people, prisoners of war are converted into slaves. Even the Romans had large number of slaves. The Romans, of course, we know that the Romans' imprint is in Africa, the Romans' imprint is in Asia, the Romans' imprint is in Europe, and all these places in which they conquered, they made sure a lot of the prisoners of war were converted into slaves. Those slaves do menial works at home, household works. Some of those slaves, if it's a woman, are concubines. Some of those slaves do work in farms. Some of those slaves do work in so many places. So great civilizations, great empires, most great civilizations, great empires have been built to the level it became because of the labor of slaves. And now we are seeing that replicate itself in the Americas now. We are seeing that replicate itself in the Americas. So I stand to say that slave labor made America great. Slave labor made America great. So people may question this and argue this. Without cheap labor from the slaves, of course, it would have been difficult for the Americas, I'm talking of North and South America, to have achieved what it has achieved today. Remember, the Americans started far back, not the period where Europe started from, not the period where Africa started from, not the period where Asia started from. It started around 1500 when the discovery of the Spaniards and Columbus and co. created a new world, and the new world was named America. So you could see how fast those two continents had grown. Although there will be people who argue that those two continents had people from the other continents, and as such, the knowledge they brought there also we are part of it. But that knowledge is part of it. But I want to say that cheap labor, which is slave labor, was one of the things that majorly helped the Americans to grow. As more mines were opened up, I'm going back to what was happening in America now. As more mines were opened up and more plantations were set up, so the demand for slaves increased. Increase in plantation, increase in mines meant more slaves will be picked up. Increase in plantation, increase in mines meant more slaves will be needed. Between 1530 and 1600, an average of 13,000 slaves a year were being exported. Between 1530 and 1600, an average of 13,000 slaves a year were being exported to the Americas. This number rose to about 27,500 a year in the 17th century to 70,000 in the 18th century, and by the 1830s, it has soared to a far higher number. The plantations were increasing, the mines were increasing, and more persons were needed from Africa to go to the Americas to do slavery labor. I want to let us know that anywhere we see black men, they must have been there, especially in Europe and the Americas, through slavery. The first group, large group, may have been there through slavery. Of course, there are some who say that the chiefs of the Spaniards had black people who had joined them, but that is not very assertive from my own studies. That is not very assertive. Most of the black people you see in the Americas were slave traders. Most of the black people you see in the Americas were slave traders. Most of the black people you see in the Americas were slave laborers. Most of these slaves were exported from the region between modern Ghana, which means our present Ghana, the Cameroon, Angola, and Congo, which also includes Nigeria, had a large chunk of slaves taken from there to the Americas. The slaves from Ghana were known in the Americas and the West Indies as the Coromatin. Coromatin Negroes. I think I got that pronunciation well. I think it's best I spell it for those who are listening so that they can pronounce it in the best way they can. Coromatin. Coromatin is Coromantine. Coromatin. Coromatine. Coromatin Negroes. A name derived from the coastal port of the same name where the English built. A name derived from the coastal port of the same name where the English built. A name derived from the coastal port of the same name where the English built their first lodge, where the English first settled in 1631. They were considered the most courageous, so which means the Coromatin slaves were considered the most courageous and the most hardworking, and also seen to be proud and unyielding to all the slaves. The Coromatin Negroes were seen to be proud and also unyielding of all the slaves, and were often the leaders of slave mutinies, which means the Coromatin slaves were already creating problems for Europeans. Even from that period. Even when they were taking them there, they were already creating problems for the Europeans. They were already creating problems for the Europeans. So you will see that the chromatin slaves, even from that period, that early period, you will see by the time they were abolishing slave trade, one of the reasons would be the fact that a lot of crises, a lot of riots, a lot of things were being done, which created that view to stop slave trade. But we are not getting there yet. When we get there, it will be explained to you. So you will see that these chromatin slaves were always almost seen as slaves who create what we call slave mutinies, fighting against their masters and against the European leaders who are taking them to this place. Edward Long, who wrote a history, Edward Long, who wrote in his book A History of Jamaica in 1774, called them ferocious and stubborn. The chromatin slaves were seen to be ferocious, and they were seen to be stubborn. So take that note of that. The chromatin slaves were seen to be ferocious, were seen to be stubborn, and mentioned a slave uprising in which 33 chromatins, most 33 chromatins were wounded and killed. That was what Edward Long said. In one of the mutinies, about 33 chromatins were wounded and murdered and wounded and were killed. 19 whites in the space of an hour were dealt with. 19 whites in the space of an hour were dealt with. So the Jamaican House of Assembly describes a series of slave revolts during the middle of the 18th century and reported that all these disturbances have been planned and conducted by the chromatin Negroes. So you could take note of that. The chromatin Negroes were seen to be stubborn, ferocious, and difficult. And because they were seen to be stubborn, ferocious, and difficult, they were creating crises in Europe. And this crisis, crisis in Europe, not Europe per se, in the Americas, this crisis which they were creating was something which is giving the Europeans some form of headache. But I must let us know, slave trade was indeed a heinous crime. It's something that, when looked upon, it's not something that should be celebrated. Some group of Africans were taken to the Americans, not their will, but some persons capturing them and throwing them into a ship after being sold to the white man, and the white man takes them to the Americans, and this group of persons were sold. Let me let you know how this is done. The white man is not the major culprit of this. Black Africans were being cajoled to get slaves for the white man. And these white people go with these slaves that were sold to them in exchange of cheap things such as mirror, such as umbrellas, such as gunpowder, things that could not be compared to human life. Though the sale of criminals as punishment was not new in Africa, at the beginning it was as if the African chiefs were selling the criminals or their prisoners of war. But one thing I must let you know, as the demand became higher and higher, it wasn't just criminals that were sold,
so many people who are not even committed a crime were taken and sold to the white man, and the white man with his ship takes them abroad. While in the ship, some persons may die, and if they die, they are casted out into the sea. That took some thousands or millions of Africans who had died and casted out into the sea. The greatest sources of supply of slaves, however, were raids conducted. The greatest sources of slaves, supply of slaves, were raids conducted for the sole purpose of catching men for sale, and above all, intergroup and interstate wars, which produced thousands of war captives. Take note, war captives. Remember when the Romans were also using slaves? War captives are majorly those who become slaves. The blood of slaves, the back of slaves, were majorly a reason why great empires existed. I stand to be challenged. The blood of slaves, the labor of slaves, were majorly why great empires existed. We all know the factors of labor, the factors of production, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and all that. But labor, very essential. And that labor, most empires used it to their advantage, slaves to their advantage, to develop those places. Captain John Hall, who voyaged to Africa in 1772 and 1776, reports that an appearance of slave ship at Old Calabar was the signal for Africans to go upstream in their war canoes, and they usually return 2 or 3 weeks later with their canoes full of slaves. You saw what is happening. Captain John Hall describing the scenario here. When Africans see the white man ships, they quickly move to create a scenario of war. And this war which they create is to make sure they get prisoners of war. And prisoners of war are packed in their canoes or ships. That's the scenario painted in Old Calabar. And these canoes or ships, which these prisoners of war are packed, are now sold. Those slaves are now sold to the white man. So the white man only is not the culprit here. African chiefs, African leaders at that time were part of the problems that created this heinous crime. They did it for almost pittances in today's parlance, for things that could not be equal to the life of men. All these slaves were bartered for European merchandise, such as guns, gunpowder, textiles, rum, beads, tobacco, iron, copper, and so many other things were sold in exchange of human lives. And so many other things were sold in exchange of human life. Take into context what was sold in exchange of human life. Guns, gunpowder, textiles, rum, beads, tobacco, and iron, and copper bars. All these things were sold in exchange of slaves. which means the white man gives them guns, gunpowder, textiles, rum, beads, tobacco, and iron and copper bars in exchange of black slaves. These black slaves are now taken to Europe to be used for plantation labor or labor in the mines. It was between £3 and £4 between 1600 and 1690, £10 by 1700, £18 by 1730, and £27 by 1800. The net sale of the price of slaves in the West Indies during the what we are trying to say here is that the net sale price always had increased because of the demand, and by the 18th century, slaves were now being sold for £40 equivalent. Were now being sold for £40 equivalent. So you can take into context what was happening around this time. You can take into context what was happening around this time. You can take into context what was happening around this time. That slave trades during this period, the push for slaves increased in price, and the people who were demanding it were Europeans who would take it to the Americas. The people who were demanding it were Europeans who would take it to the Americans. But I must let you all know, what is the effect of slave trade? What is the effect of slave trade to the two continents? European historians always contend that parts of populated areas in the region. European historians are always want to justify that slave trade had not even committed, is not much of a heinous right. After all, according to them, the population of the region also increased. It was dense, and also slave trade in itself was something which brought development to West Africa, or to those places in Africa where slaves were taken from. So put that into context. That is what Europeans would argue. Such an argument is invalid. I must let you know, such an argument is invalid on both development of political institutions and so many other things. Such an argument cannot be considered valid. So, which means Europeans are trying to let us know that slave trade indeed was something which is good and deserves to be commended rather than to be pushed. But I want to let us know that great empires, just as I've mentioned before, great empires always dwell, always push, always improve through the blood, the back, the labor of slaves. I want us to contest that. Every society in the past, the Babylonian, remember the Hammurabi Code, which now tried distinguishing, bringing laws, although these laws also justify the rich above the poor, justified men above women. But man had always tried to reduce the social relationship between individuals of each society. Despite the way man tries to do that, there will be some who will be unfortunate, who become just like slaves. In some cases, during the feudal system, serfs and slaves, and so many other things. So in any society, there will be, just like somebody told me, said there will be always a poor man, because some would have to be the unfortunate one in society. But those unfortunate ones are the ones who are not so fortunate, so unfortunate, are used to develop their societies. Great societies work because of cheap labor, and cheap labor is nothing becomes cheap better than slavery, and slavery is what is used against. So you could see the argument from the British and all that. According to the latest studies from some historians, about 15 million to 15.4 million were exported from Africa to the Americas. These figures does not include those who died during the raid, and the march to the coast. What is particularly lamentable is that the victims were the most virile and active of the people of West Africa. One thing which we must take into context, the best of Africa we are taking to the Americas. So you could see why the American society grew faster. The most knowledgeable, the most strongest of slaves were taken to help American society to develop. It is even lamentable that for the women, the most virile were also taken. For those communities in America to develop. In March 1722, the directors of the African Company in London instructed their agents in Cape Coast Castle that they should get ready cargoes of 600 slaves each, who should all be good merchantable Negroes. Which means what they are saying is they need people who would sell, who will be sold. But these people who will be sold would be people who are good and strong and virile, and those who would help the American society, who will be marketable. Of course, sick people are not in the trading of slaves, cannot be good market. People who are weak, old women, for instance, cannot be marketable. It is young, virile females that will be marketable, because there they will give birth to children. Remember, those children will become slaves, and the slave master will be increased. His wealth will be increased by those children given birth to by a slave. So today we see people in the Americas. A lot of them have gone there in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and they went there as slaves. They went there as slaves. Secondly, the raiding and wars which the trade generated steadily intensified, caused a great deal of misery, bloodshed, and destruction. Old villages and towns were burned down, and as many people were killed and were caught. So you could see what the slave trade had created. You could see what the slave trade had created. So much had been done. Bloodshed, misery, destruction. Remember, most of those slaves, prisoners of war, were prisoners of war, which means wars are not picnics. Wars are things which create death, which create sorrow, which create pain. And the Africans will create wars among themselves, take the slaves and sell the slaves, to take the prisoners of war and sell them to whites, to the Europeans, who now make them slaves, and those slaves are taken off to Europe and America, and most especially America, for serious labor work. And this created so much problem. The civil wars between communities reduced the level of development Africa should have. In a place that we had wars and wars and wars and wars and wars and wars, surely, of course, the African society at then would either stagnate or reduce or increase in minimal development. So we can see all the things which the slave trade had cost. The slave trade took the healthiest of our people, of Africans, took the most virile of the women. The slave trade created unpardonable destruction of population, unnecessary wars among African communities, all in the name to get humans to be sold to the Europeans. And the inter-community wars of slaves created more problem of the slaves. So we could see that slave societies, slaves had faced so much issues. Slave societies, slaves had faced so much issues. With all this, American society began to develop cheap on very pay. They spent almost nothing on wages of slaves, apart from feeding the slaves, even in most times once in a day. And those, there have been discussions by historians, slaves who were supposed to eat, maybe the plantation is banana plantation or where edible foods are planted. Slaves, their mouths were padlocked so that they would not eat from those plantations. So that they will not eat from those. All these are created so much problem for the African population. The slave trade was also mainly responsible for the late development of the production of cash crops. The slave trade was also mainly responsible for the late development of the production of cash crops in West Africa. Since the European government saw this as a positive trade, especially from the 1740s onwards. For instance, in 1791, the British Board of Trade ordered Thomas Melville, the governor of Cape Coast Castle, to stop the development of cotton cultivation among the Fante for commercial reasons, which are most illuminating. You will see that the slave trade reduced Africa, made Africa a primary market, made Africa backward, made Africa not to get to the peak. You could see how this trade affected Africa. When some Europeans even tried investing and putting cash crops on the ground, they were stopped. The introduction of culture and industry amongst the Negro is contrary to the known established policy of this country. There is no saying where this might stop. It might extend to tobacco, sugar, and every other commodity. You could see the British Board of Trade cautioning Melvin not to venture into creating a scenario or a posture where cash crop will start growing in Africa, because they knew if cash crops start growing in Africa, the development in Africa would be faster. But they stopped it. The British stopped it. So you could see all this. But despite this heinous crime, again, I want to explain that slave trade did not start with the transatlantic slave trade. Even within the trans-Saharan trade, slave trade had begun among Europeans, Romans, Greeks, Sumerians, Babylonians, are all groups of persons have thrived with slaves, and great empires are built because of slaves. So you could see that indeed the slave trade has its positives and has its negatives. But what were those reasons later on that got all Europe frustrated about the slave trade and asked that the slave trade be abolished? And asked that the slave trade be abolished. That is where we are going to now. Why did Europe get frustrated with the slave trade and ask that the slave trade be abolished? There is still a great deal of controversy over the circumstances which led to the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. Some historians attribute the abolition of slave trade to purely humanitarian or moral and even religious consideration. You could say that's quite funny. Historians are always having a way of trying to justify something which are heinous. There are some who say that the slave trade, in today's palace, the British got born again, and as such, slave trade, they thought of slave trade to be bad. They looked at the moral, religious, and humanitarian, of course, but that is not to be so. That is a little part of it, but not to be so. Others argue that the slave trade and slavery were abolished mainly for economic reasons. One such writer, Curtin, a Sierra Leonean, is of this kind of opinion. A Sierra Leonean, one of those historians, Curtin, believes that because of economic reasons, slave trade was abolished. The slave trade was abolished largely because it was now becoming more not profitable, and as such, it was now abolished, according to Curtin. And he says that the trade in legitimate trade, cash crops, became more profitable. And it is better, according to Curtin, to look inwards, penetrating to Africa, to seek African mineral resources rather than to seek Africans themselves for labor. To seek African mineral resources rather than to seek Africans themselves for labor. So you could see that seeking African mineral resources, some of us would have, who is knowledgeable about the history, historical, the coming of Europeans, would know that there were a group of the explorers who came to study the land, who came to study African land, African resources, African vegetation, to see the rich areas in Africa, and what their reports created that allowed for European colonization of Africa. So that, for Curtin, it is better to seek African mineral resources rather than to seek Africans themselves. That was what Curtin was saying. From a careful study of the evidence, and after an examination from myself, I feel that all writers have a point. I feel that all writers have a point. The economic reason, the moral reason, the political reason, all these were part of the reasons where slave trade was abolished. The slave trade was condemned alike by philosophers and economists such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Philosophers and economists such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau condemned the slave trade. Adam Smith, for instance, condemned the slave trade. And John Wesley also had to condemn the slave trade. Samuel Johnson condemned the slave trade. And Daniel Defoe condemned the slave trade. All these groups of persons began to condemn this slave trade. Secondly, all the people who actually organized and launched the attack on the slave trade and remained persistently in the forefront of the campaign were men who personally committed to the evangelical and humanitarian ideas of the day. They included such well-known abolitionists as Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce, and later Forwell Boston and James Stephen. All these groups of people were organized the abolition of slavery. They organized the abolition of slavery. So we could see from these perspectives what some of these persons were doing. It was these people who formed the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in May 1787. May 1787. It was these people who pushed the evangelicals and the humanitarian idea. People like Wilberforce, Forwell Buxton, and all that. They pushed for the abolition of the slave trade. And the British Anti-Slavery Society in 1823. And it was these two societies who were at the forefront of abolishing the slave trade, who were at the forefront of abolishing the slave trade. These two societies, the British Anti-Slavery Society was at the forefront of abolishing the slave trade. The British Anti-Slavery Society, for instance, was at that forefront of abolishing the slave trade. They organized branches throughout the country with a view to arousing public opinion against the trade, opinion against the trade. They organized all sorts of things, try to create a crusade, create everything to organize public opinion against this slave trade. They saw it from the moral and humanitarian perspective. These are all those things which created and made groups of people to want to stop the slavery, to want to abolish the slavery. But there are some who are of the thought that the Industrial Revolution was a major reason why the slave trade stopped. There were some who believed that the Industrial Revolution was a major reason why the coming of the machines. The more machines emerged, the more labor in physical form was not needed. The more machines increased, the more labor in physical form was not needed. So then there was those who felt that the trouble caused by agitations of slaves, crisis created by slaves, are enough reasons to stop slave trade. So we could see that so many reasons are adduced as reasons why slave trade must be stopped. So many reasons are adduced as reasons why slave trade must be stopped. By the end of the 18th century, the British West Indian Islands had all the slaves they needed. And in fact, about 50% were being re-exported to the islands of the other European powers. It meant, therefore, that abolition would not be totally ruinous to them. They had enough slaves. Why should they add more? Secondly, even some of the British West Indian planters began to support the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade from the beginning of the 19th century because they were alarmed at the competitive development of the new fertile French and Dutch islands, which the British had conquered during the wars fought between 1792 and 1802. Take into cognizance that the British were at the forefront of stopping the slave trade because they were now finding it difficult to and seeing it that they are now being their dominance in trade is being challenged by the Dutch and the French, and as such, the more slaves that come in, the challenge would increase, which they do not want. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons leading to the passing of the Abolition Bill in 1807 was the division that occurred in the ranks of the West Indian planters' interests in Parliament. Thirdly, since Brazil and Cuba were producing sugar in greater quantities and more cheaply during the second half of the 19th century, British West Indian sugar could not be sold in continental market. So you could see all the factors that created slave trade to be abolished. It wasn't for the fact that they became born again, just like I said. So many factors led to the slave trade to be abolished. So many factors led to the slave trade to be abolished. And when the slave trade was abolished, the legitimate trade came to replace the slave trade. The slave trade is trade human for goods. The legitimate trade is goods for goods. The legitimate trade is goods for goods. So we can see that the slave trade was becoming unpopular, but it has already done its damage. Was becoming unpopular, but it has already done its damage. And the damage which it had done had affected so many things. The damage which it had done had affected so many things. For instance, a lot of Africans were killed during the slave trade. A lot of millions of Africans were killed during the slave trade. Millions of Africans were killed during the slave trade. Africans were not treated in a very good way. Africans were not treated in a very good way. The African society was not developing in the way it should be. The African society was not developing in the ways. So all these things were part of the reasons why the slave trade had created so much damage into Africa. It had created so much damage, so much problems, and for the first time, a group of people, a race, were labeled and made to look inferior to other races. A race were labeled and made to look inferior. Let me explain this. Anything that is associated with slavery means inferiority. Anything that is associated with slavery means inferiority. And inferiority in this sense created more problems for Africans. Even today, there are so many people who are ashamed to be Africans. There are so many people who are ashamed to be Africans. They feel that because their ancestors had been slaves, they are unequal to other races. They are unequal to other races. All these things made Africans have their psyche not properly in the correct mode. Not properly in the correct mode. I'm trying as much as possible not to say some things because I feel that the slave trade had indeed done so much damage to Africa. Africans celebrate going abroad today, all in the name to go and meet their
a superior group. Africans celebrate to leave their continent today. They even die in the seas. They even do so many things, all in the name to go and meet some superior group, instead of them to make sure their own continent grow and develop. They go to other societies. Black Americans, black Brazilians, black South Americans are ashamed to identify with Africa. The media continues today to postulate, to push Africa as a disorientated society, whereas the damage of the slave trade still continues. The slave trade had created so much ruin upon Africans, and Europeans today should even pay Africans reparations. They have done so much damage by the creation of this slave business. Although you don't have to blame only the Europeans, African chiefs as at then have been collaborators and have made Africans look impoverished, look as inferiors to their superior masters. It is high time for those who are listening to this lecture to see it as a challenge. If black Americans, black South Americans, those blacks in Europe combine, just like the Jews are doing, to support the home continent, so that the home continent can get a leverage over this initiative of pushing them as an inferior race. Even at that, Africans still are struggling to achieve what they are still achieving. Although today, like the old leaders who sold our people for slavery, we still have leaders who continue to impoverish, steal through corruption, African Commonwealth. And these leaders should stop this attitude so that the continent of Africa would grow. But slave trade, although I've explained that slave trade is something that all societies practice. Nations have grown, nations have developed on the back of slaves, on the blood of slaves, and we should take cognizance of that. But the transatlantic slave trade has created more problems and has created more things, more heinous issues, which has led the continent of Africa to remain as it is. Any question? Any question? I'm giving you 2 minutes. Two minutes. Those of you listening to the lecture, any question? Any question? Waiting for your questions concerning the transatlantic slave trade. Waiting for your questions concerning the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, no question, but I want to say this. This lecture should be shared with as many Africans as possible. We have to reorientate ourselves
to push ourselves to be better than what we are. We should not be celebrating the fact that we some of us run abroad. It is foolishness for us to be running abroad. Africa should be developed. Africa should do better than what it is. I want us to share it to as many persons as possible to listen to the transatlantic slave trade lecture. Since no question, bye.